Towards a humanoid.
Violence has been a staple of video games almost as long as they've existed. Granted, it wasn't until later that gore became coupled with video game violence. Probably because an old Pong machine would burst into tears if anything besides 2 blocks and a moving square were being rendered. Even by the Super Nintendo days, consoles could barely run Doom properly. However, the actual act of inflicting physical harm on others has almost always been there. Pac-Man runs around eating ghosts, Mario flattens the local wildlife by jumping on their heads, and Contra was basically taking Vietnam and replacing the relatable humans with easily hateable, alien-controlled private military guys. The fact that we've gotten to a point where an Italian stereotype curb-stomping wildlife is barely considered an act of violence in our minds shows how far video game violence has come. But throughout it all, there's a constant. Players are almost always rewarded for engaging in said violence, but games very rarely have the violence as anything more than a stylistic choice. The worst games might do to offer criticism towards the player is a point reduction. Man, I just shot an unarmed suspect in the head and lost a good cop point. Now I gotta go illegally search people to get it back. Well, I'll tell you what, true crime made me change my ways. Or binary karma system that does more to trivialize the issue than just ignoring it. Oh no, High Chaos, I'm sorry, I actually tried to have fun in your video game. Games like Call of Duty pride themselves on realism, yet they and many modern war games like it have become quite infamous for their lack of realism and how characters deal with violence. In most games, the character and player are never faced by the fact that the fun of the game comes from ending human lives, that a real person involved in many of these situations would almost certainly come out traumatized. Hell, Nathan Drake in the Uncharted series constantly cracks jokes about how many people he kills without even batting an eye.
You're up for this. Feel a lot better if I had a gun. We won't need them. A little insurance, that's all. Flynn, they're just museum guards.
There's a guy below you, there's a guy below you.
However, sometimes games do play with violence as a narrative and game mechanic, and use that against the player. That's what this video series is about. I'm going to discuss 3 games in particular that take the violence that a player typically engages in and turns it against them. Which brings me to the first game I'm going to talk about, Manhunt. Before we get to Manhunt, our story is going to rewind a bit to the year 1996, when a company by the name DMA Design was originally set to release a launch title for the N64. The title was Body Harvest, and was originally designed with heavy involvement from Nintendo. As we all know, plans often don't go as intended, and what was supposed to be published by Nintendo in 1996 ended up getting put out by Midway and Gremlin Interactive in 1998. Nintendo had grown concerned with Body Harvest violence and backed out of publishing it. This mini episode of controversy would be a precedent for the company's later public exposure. In the time they were dealing with trying to get Body Harvest out, DMA would release a title whose name you might find familiar, Grand Theft Auto. While the first 2 games received overall favorable reviews and stirred some controversy, it wasn't until the 3rd main entry that all of these elements were kicked into overdrive, making the series the critical darling, sales juggernaut, and maypole of controversy we know today. Grand Theft Auto 3 set the world on fire in more ways than one. Not only did it revolutionize how games would treat fully 3D play, help cement gaming as art by providing top quality writing and voice acting, and codify the now oversaturated sandbox genre, but it also ushered in a new era of public outcry against mature content in gaming. Political advocacy groups argued it should get an adults-only rating, effectively banning it from most retailers. Fake lawyers tried to pin it on real-life crimes. Hack politicians tried to use it to distract voters from the fact that they were openly supporting an illegal war that would kill millions and cost taxpayers trillions. And even some within the industry itself argued GTA 3 went too far. Video games have had negative press before, but GTA 3 took it to an extent that if you merely ask someone about controversy in video games, GTA 3, or at least one of its sequels, will be the game that pops into their head. By the time the next entry in the franchise, Vice City, hit shelves, DMA Design had become Rockstar North, and GTA was the household name we know today. It would continue its predecessor's trend of controversy, both because of its violence and due to its depiction of ethnic groups, in particular the Haitian gang. The Haitian American Council of North Miami even tried to get the sale of violent video games to anyone under 18 banned locally due to their anger over the Haitian gang.
Fun fact. A lawsuit was actually filed against Rockstar as recent as July 2017 over this game. The suit is over the character Auntie Paulette and was filed by the Psychic Friends Network. They argued the character was unlawfully profiting off the image of the late Miss Cleo, despite the fact that Auntie Paulette was voiced by Yori Harris, the woman behind the Miss Cleo persona.
Judging from an IGN interview with series-long producer and writer Dan Houser, while DMA/Rockstar North expected controversy, they didn't quite anticipate just how big the outcry would be when they made GTA 3. But by Vice City, I think it's fair to say that they would be more prepared. And this is where Manhunt rears its ugly head. From its concept alone, Manhunt sounds like a practical joke from Rockstar North. Let's do a thought experiment real quick. Imagine you are back in 2004 and you're trying to convince your parents to buy you Manhunt. Because adults incessantly whining about it is the primary reason you even know it exists. You get to the part where you try to explain what it's about and tell them it's a game by the people who made Grand Theft Auto and it's about a guy who's in a snuff film getting points for how violently you can kill people. I don't know about you, but I can imagine the rolling eyes and the "oh, of course it is" responses, as if I had taken a time machine back and was seeing them in front of me. Christian Cantamessa, the lead level designer and one of the lead writers on the game, stated in an IGN article, "We want to create a game that delivers a scathing social commentary on media voyeurism, the peddling of violence as entertainment, and the inbred inaccuracy of the American penal system." And I believe the developers did just that. Rockstar North achieved what I believe they wanted to: create a game guaranteed to create controversy in order to spur sales. And it worked. While Manhunt wasn't the mega success that GTA games were, the controversy surrounding it made Manhunt sell well enough to get it a sequel and multiple re-releases on later consoles. Parents and the media were decrying it, but somehow it was still performing admirably. Yahtzee said it best.
There's a very clear certification indicating that 12-year-olds aren't supposed to be playing it, but there's no denying that they play it anyway, because no one other than 12-year-olds are into this sort of thing.
While I'm sure a good chunk of Manhunt's audience was in fact adults, I'm equally sure kids were getting their hands on it. Given that most retailers require parents to purchase M-rated games, and your average teenager does not have their own disposable income source, this meant parents were buying this game for their kids. Those same parents who claim violent video games were corrupting their youth were also effectively buying the video game equivalent of a snuff film for their children. Manhunt and its players couldn't dodge its violent content by saying players were free to not engage in it, the excuse Rockstar themselves like to use to defend GTA. Violence was not only mandatory for part of the game, but it was front and center, the definitive point of the game.
There's a hunter in the next room through the mesh door. Hack him up and I'll buzz open the next set of doors for you.
Manhunt wasn't marketing itself based on its gameplay, which, while fun and cathartic, was many notches behind its contemporaries. Its fellow 6th generation competition was Splinter Cell, Metal Gear Solid 2, and Hitman. And compared to those, Manhunt's gameplay feels like an arcade game. Hell, even games from the previous generation, such as Thief and Tenchu, had far more complex mechanics than anything Manhunt can offer. The standout feature was the horrific violence you inflict on your enemies. Considering that Rockstar's marketing in no way tried to hide this fact, what does it say about parents who bought the game for their kids anyways? What does it say about the people who bought such a game for entertainment? Before consumers have even gotten home and thrown it in their gaming platform of choice, Manhunt is raising its eyebrow and serving up an accusatory glare at its owner. Despite what many claim, Manhunt wasn't infamous because it had the most blood. Games like Mortal Kombat still had a beat by a long shot, but rather because the violence was presented in such a cruel and torturous light. James Earl Cash didn't simply throw a bag on some poor maniac's head, and that was that. The player was treated to the victim's futile grasps for air, and the sight of James punching them repeatedly until finally you hear the crack as James breaks his neck and the victim falls to the floor, silent. The attention to detail in the game's executions, along with the story, writing, and setting, took down that layer of separation between whimsical game violence and the grotesque reality of murder that most games keep up to avoid making its audience feel uncomfortable. The difference of intent behind the bloodshed can be summed up by simply comparing the decapitations between GTA and Manhunt. Notice GTA's clean removal, almost like popping the head off of a doll, with a cartoonish blood fountain and the victim's almost operatic melodrama about the whole affair. Now look at Manhunt's. Decapitations in this game are anything but tidy. The head isn't so much blown off as a giant hole is made in it. You can see the tattered pieces of flesh hit the wall behind the guy, complete with revolting squishy audio cues, and the hunter slowly dropping to the floor, lifeless.
Hey everybody, he's Kane!
The game sets up its morbid content by having it be about James Earl Cash, a convict, being forced into the making of a snuff film, where he is put against a large group of hunters and forced to sneak around and kill to survive. The executions I mentioned above are the most well-known element of the game. The way they work is, when you sneak up on an enemy with a weapon and then lock on, James will assume a stance, and if you hold the action button, the lock-on cursor will become white. As you hold the action button, the cursor will change from white to yellow to red, with each color respectively indicating an ascending gruesomeness of the execution you will perform. The more cruel the kill, the more points go towards your level score. Each level is referred to as a scene, and your score for each is represented as an amount of stars out of 4 or 5. 4 for fetish difficulty and 5 for hardcore. Stars reward the player with unlockable extras, such as bios and extra levels. However, the player is free to ignore the mechanic and simply deal with their enemies in quicker, less violent ways. Video games having scoring systems is nothing new. Historically, it's been a common method to get players motivated to keep playing a game. Many games also directly tie the level of violence the player causes to the score, such as with Mad World. However, like with violence, this is usually kept strictly separate from a game's narrative. It's there to be fun and nothing else. Manhunt is an exception to this trend, as the scoring is directly interwoven to understanding the message of the game. The execution mechanic is fairly obvious about how there's no practical reason to pay any attention to it. It adds a huge amount of risk to trying to kill predators, as James is forced to stand out in the open for long periods of time, hoping either the hopeful victim doesn't turn around or one of his mates doesn't show up from around the corner to botch the entire thing. Wasting time waiting for a gruesome execution also means you lose time in other regards, such as time to hide the body to avoid alerting the other hunters. Even disregarding all those risks, the executions themselves tend to present more liability the more violent they are. They take longer and are noisier, making it more likely for your victim's mate to walk around the corner and air his grievances to you, or for you to alert the guard patrolling on the other side of the street. In short, there's no point to the execution level mechanic from a logical standpoint. It literally only serves to make it more likely to get yourself killed. So why are you doing it? Because it gets you a better rating. But why do you care about stars? To get extras. At this point, it's important to look at how the main menu to the game is set up. It is designed to look as if it is the menu to a DVD, complete with a scene selection and extras. This is more than a stylistic choice. It means we are literally playing through one of Starkweather's snuff films, and by unlocking extras, you are in a sense creating the viewer's special edition of the film, complete with scene-by-scene reviews and deleted scenes. But wait a second. Starkweather is the evil psychopath that put us in the movie to begin with, forcing us to kill to line his pockets, and for his sexual pleasure.
Nice, Cash. Nice.
So why are we helping him out by making him 5-star scenes and DVD extras? It is in this dissonance that the scoring system shows its true intent, to trick the player into doing exactly as the bad guy wants them to do. The only thing in the main game that tells the player that they should be causing the most blood splatter is Starkweather himself. He revels in the brutality.
Ice that chump. You're really getting me off.
And quickly becomes agitated when that supply is cut off by taking the scene too slow or choosing to perform less brutal execution.
Move it,
saw
Cash.
something, I swear.
I'm not keeping you alive to sulk in the dark.
The first enemy encountered in the game is literally put there by Starkweather to have James kill him, to use him as a practice dummy to introduce the execution mechanic, and as an induction ceremony into the twisted underground world that Starkweather has created.
I'll be frank with you. We set that jump up to see if you had what it takes to be our leading man. A little audition, if you will.
Yet, most players won't realize that this ceremony can be bypassed. By simply running past him, the potential victim can be spared, and he won't even make a real attempt to pursue the player. The only penalty is the loss of Starkweather's pat on the back, and reduction in score. Likewise, almost all killing besides certain mandatory sequences can be avoided, if the player decides they don't want to play Starkweather's game. Just compare my score in the level White Trash when I played normally versus when I did a pacifist run. By no means is Starkweather a person you want to do favors for. Even if his treatment of others as cows to be slaughtered doesn't make you hate him, he also does everything in his power to attack James and the player directly, regardless of how cooperative either chooses to be. At one point, he has James's family kidnapped and held as hostages, telling James to go rescue them, then proceeds to have them all executed on film anyways, then has an entire level devoted to tricking James into obtaining the recording and watching it. Later in the game, James goes against Starkweather and no longer takes orders from him, yet the player is still graded on their violence. By then, the player has been given every reason to hate him, and now can't even claim to be being ordered to continue the carnage. All acts of violence past that point are 100% the player's and James's initiative, but it's too late. They have already assumed the mindset Starkweather wants them to be in. His guidance is no longer necessary. Starkweather himself says it best at the beginning of the game.
I'll try to direct you as best I can, but other than that, you're on your own. It's up to you.
The unlockable extras aren't even great incentives. Most of it is bios of stuff that didn't make it into the final game, and the biggest pieces are 4 deleted scenes. One of those scenes puts James in an arena where he is forced to engage in the sluggish and slow hand-to-hand combat of the game. Another sees James in a massive gunfight with a bunch of humanoid monkeys, and Manhunt is in no way designed to be a shooter. Another throws you in a confined area and tasks you with killing as many baddies as possible, and the last one has James killing all the guards in the area within the time limit. So the extra scenes range from outright unplayable to just boring, and cut off from all context, they are just violence for violence's sake, which is exactly what Starkweather and his audience want. So the game has the player inadvertently playing right into the villain's hands. That's not exactly new. Antagonists trick pro-tags into doing their bidding all the time, and given how much control Starkweather has over the situation James is in, being able to get him into any mindset he chooses wouldn't be hard. However, the player is never required to play along with Starkweather's mind games at all, and after James goes rogue on Starkweather, the occasional kill all baddies to continue requirement is dropped altogether. So it's not simply Starkweather forcing James to be like him, that element was already at play. Violence being Manhunt's biggest selling point, and that especially being the case after the controversy said violence caused, a very large part of Manhunt's player base would be playing for the gore, and that is where the player and Starkweather are kindred spirits. The player goes for the more brutal executions because they want to see them. White executions are boring. James doesn't even stab the guy repeatedly in the face with a glass shard, so what's the point? Even if the player tries to avoid the explicit violence of the executions by engaging in the more tame hand-to-hand homicide, at a low enough level, Cash knocks the enemy down to the floor, where the enemy will plead for their lives.
Don't finish me, I got kids.
Before James gives the final few blows. The player must kill them or they will get back up and continue the attack, but the fact remains that the player is still killing a helpless individual. At some level, players who revel in this violence are engaging in the exact same sick pleasure that Starkweather does, and to that end are equally guilty in the events that unfold in the game. Back to the point I made about the aesthetic design of the game. With the meta aspect of this game in mind, the grainy, home video quality of the graphics, and the DVD main menu, it's clear that the game is representative of an actual snuff film by Starkweather's business. But let's bring that out a bit. The game originally came with a manual that was designed to resemble a catalog of all the products and services Valiant Video Enterprises, Starkweather's distributor, has to offer. It introduced the player to the stars of past snuff films, and refers to James Earl Cash as the star of Starkweather's latest production. That's a bit odd, considering Starkweather dies at the end of the game, so unless he very quickly produced copies of all the scenes James was in, made a marketing campaign for it, and put it up for sale within the day or two the game takes place over, the catalog makes no sense to be written how it is. It's also worth noting that, in describing the fourth level of the game, White Trash, the manual refers to it as Starkweather's fourth production since losing his career in Hollywood. While this initially implies that James is starring in Starsky's first overall film in the snuff circuit, it seems unlikely that he would have such organization on the scale we see if he was still an amateur, and it's heavily implied that at least two other in-game characters, Pigsy and the Tramp, have previously starred in his features. This could be chalked up to the writers just wanting to make a cool manual, and it very well could be. But the manual goes to great lengths to sound exactly like it's an in-universe item James should be able to pick up and read. It gives off information that never comes into play during the game, such as the specific kill preferences of the hunter groups James encounters, or, more importantly, the existence of Mr. Nasty, the ringleader of Valiant Video Enterprises and main financial backer of Starkweather's snuff films. Services being offered by stars in Starkweather's films are also advertised, offering protection to the reader, and the manual ends with a warning to never mention what the reader has seen to anyone else, even bringing up that there's a vouching system in place for new customers to enter the community. If one actually searches for the Valiant website that's advertised in the manual, one will find a petition to get Manhunt 3 made. But then, if you scroll all the way down, you can find a link to an archive version of the actual site, complete with mock snuff merchandise and fan forums, ran by none other than Mr. Nasty himself. Side note, I wouldn't entirely recommend actually visiting this site, as it kept trying to download stuff to my computer automatically, even if it just seemed to be broken video files. An entire niche market is written in great detail for seemingly no other reason than to be a cool manual. It all goes towards establishing the simple fact that Manhunt, the game, is itself a snuff film, and the player has become a consumer in that market. Starkweather's dialogue throughout the game also reflects the mentality of the player. In many cases, he says exactly what is likely to be running through a player's mind at a given instant. My favorite example being his "before the night's out" lie close to the beginning of the game. In the very first cutscene of the game, Starkweather promises James that if he follows everything he is told to do, then the whole ordeal would be over, before the night's out. Said night ends rather quickly within the first third of the game, yet Starkweather only continues the film, his exact words being,
Okay, so I lied. We haven't quite wrapped this gig up. But hey, you're having fun, right?
These words are directed at the player, not James. For many players, had Starkweather ended the game there, they wouldn't be happy to be released. They'd be pissed that the game was only a few levels long and their fun was cut so short. Just think about how many games in the action genre have had the short campaign complaint levied against them. Starkweather's casual dismissal of his previous claim is him acknowledging that getting out of the film was never the player's desire. They, like Starkweather, want the carnage to continue, and also like Starkweather for their enjoyment to be derived at others' expenses. In a similar vein, as previously discussed, Starkweather oftentimes loudly expresses his satisfaction derived from James butchering human lives. We also hear his impatient side as he screams at James for not moving fast enough or killing enough. He even brings up the point I made about the manual attempting to individualize gang members that all serve a singular purpose to the player.
Sorry, I should explain. Each gang has their, let's just call it, their thing. These guys call themselves the Hoods, but none of that should bother you. As far as you're concerned, they're meat. Okay, on you go.
Ultimately, if Starkweather merely was meant as a snuff film ring boss and nothing more, his insistence of expedience and spectacle would make little sense. All Starkweather would need to do is a bit of editing in order to cut out all the parts where James sits around doing nothing, and slam together a best-of collection of his executions. However, the player does have a vested interest in keeping the violence going and minimizing waiting around, because the player cannot skip through all that. So Starkweather is yelling to get James to do something to hold the player's interest.
Available now. Manhunt, Starkweather's greatest hits. Cutting out all the fluff so you can get to the snuff. A perfect gift for any occasion.
Order now. Speaking of cuts, Manhunt treats the camera in a very unique way. During cutscenes, whether they be rendered in-engine or for executions, the game adopts an aesthetic that emphasizes its film nature, including noticeable visual noise, a literal recording symbol, and camcorder-esque resolution quality. This makes sense, considering Starkweather is supposed to be filming the events of the game, but the placement of these cameras becomes suspect very quickly. An execution in the middle of an open area is now being filmed in such a way that would require a camera to be placed right next to the player. That clearly doesn't exist. Cinematics have impossibly well-placed camera angles, even during sections where Starkweather is no longer in control of Cash's actions. And even when Cash breaks into Starkweather's own office, the film is apparently still being recorded. Obviously, the designers placed these camera shots to make sure players can see important information or get satisfaction from their kills. And at first glance, it just appears to be visual flair to spice up what are just normal game cutscenes. What say you, Mr. Cerberus member?
Maybe today I kill you, maybe not. Kill the camera.
That scene breaks the entire just a stylistic choice theory into pieces. The character acknowledged the presence of a camera, destroyed it, and then filming immediately resumed. While that makes no sense on a literal in-universe level, let's instead view the camera as a window for the player. A game character can't kill the player, or its designers. And while Mr. Cerberus might have a gun of ones and zeros that could take out a camera of ones and zeros, the real audience of the game, the player, cannot so easily be dismissed. The real camera is not the physical one Starkweather was using to film, but the digital one players use to watch and play the game. This makes all those weird camera shots make sense. Of course the player would get a perfect shot of an execution. Of course the player would have a viewpoint for any major plot point. If what the player could see was restricted to only where Starkweather put cameras, the game would be unplayable. Mr. Cerberus shooting the camera is an outright rejection of Starkweather, or anyone in-game being the true audience, and revealing that the player was the audience and in some ways filmmaker the entire time. There's many elements of the actual structure of the game and its narrative that seem odd or out of place. Manhunt is primarily billed as a stealth-based game, with a focus on executions and melee combat. However, literally all at once, it suddenly becomes hugely focused on gun battles. Starkweather drops you in a mall and just tells you guns are the new thing, so get used to it. As if he suddenly grew bored and just decided to change the game entirely. This is an extension of that lack of patience Starkweather displays when James stops the killing for 5 seconds. He doesn't even have the attention span to keep with a gameplay style for the duration of his own production. He throws in plot elements and characters that neither have context nor make any sense in the setting of the game. Cash's family is set up to be a collective damsel in distress, and then killed off to create tragedy. Ramirez is a large muscular Hispanic man who is so insanely strong that he can scare skinheads into doing his bidding for him, even when they obviously have the advantage of numbers. He's even inexplicably immune to executions during your fight with him for no particular reason. Starkweather, being an out-of-shape artist, wouldn't make for a climactic final boss fight. Instead, Pigsy, an obese, mentally challenged nude man who goes around oinking, is introduced within the last few chapters, and is capable of slaughtering an entire team of heavily armed private military men with merely a chainsaw.
It is your day. Shit. What the fuck is that? Support. Repeat. Send in. Oh shit.
The chainsaw he has even plays neatly into giving Cash a special, extra violent method to enact a unique execution, exclusively for Starkweather. Manhunt, despite its dark setting, never really ventures far from reality except in these odd sequences, and conveniently, these sequences serve to create many typical elements of your average action game. Okay, that's all well and good, but the violence is going towards a good cause, killing a monster like Starkweather, and putting an end to Valiant Video's snuff ring. Except, almost as if to rub salt in the wound, the game, and almost all material surrounding it serve to remind the player that, no, your vengeful killing spree achieved little. I've already mentioned how the manual is written as if it is a catalog put out after the game's events occurred, hinting that the snuff industry is still alive and kicking. I also mentioned Mr. Nasty, who is essentially the true mastermind behind the business. Mr. Nasty is never encountered or even mentioned in the game, so at no point is his sick trade ended. Mr. Nasty may seem like a cute little side piece of lore, but he's what Rockstar chose to have have represent the entire game on the front cover. Meaning, when a lot of people think of Manhunt, Mr. Nasty will be the first thing that pops into their head. While this might be chalked up to a random decision, the game does have another faceless puppeteer that the game is never able to confront, the corrupt police chief, Gary Schaefer.
Don't file the arrest report. Don't kill him either. Send both to me.
Hey, remember who you're talking to, you son of a...
Listen, you fuck, it's your job to clean up the city's mess. That's what you get paid for.
Speaking of Schaefer, you might say he gets his comeuppance when the journalist airs her story at the end of the game, exposing the snuff ring, and Schaefer's role in it. However, this is unlikely as...
Here, reading the Liberty Tree, and it says, in nearby Carcer City, a good day for law and order as Police Chief Gary Schaefer was cleared of corruption charges in a controversial decision by the courts. Let's hope those missing witnesses turn up safe and sound.
Now, it should be noted that evidence in Manhunt suggests that it takes place in 2003, which would place it at 2 years after the events of GTA 3, but assuming this isn't simply a continuity error, if Gary Schaefer was able to use his position to silence witnesses previously and escape prosecution, it stands to reason that he could do so again. At least the player helped the journalist get her story out, right? Unfortunately, the game doesn't even let the player have this victory, as a mock interview posted on the Manhunt site features the journalist, where it is revealed that she was institutionalized after having a mental breakdown due to the emotional toll of what she saw during her coverage of the snuff ring.
You know what happened?
You had a breakdown.
Yes, of course I had a breakdown. I got very scared. You know what I saw. How the hell would that make you feel? Idiot. Look, there is nothing wrong with me. Nothing at all. I am fine. Completely normal. I just can't forget about what I saw. About the prison. You know, we've been over this several times before. About the fact that the government is a lie. How does that happen, Mr. State-run flight deck doctor? How does that work? Tell me that, and I'll tell you what's wrong with me. You bastard, you liar, you pathetic yes man. Answer me that!
The tone of the interviewer suggests skepticism of the journalist's story, especially the part about Cash being alive.
I was behind the glass. I saw him die. Then I spoke to him. To Cash.
Did you? But no one else saw Cash or spoke to him.
This implies that their journalist's story may have become discredited due to her mental state. So after all is said and done, what does the player have to show for all their sadistic murder? Nothing other than revenge against one man, with nothing done to prevent the same thing from happening again. Ultimately, Manhunt is a game that rides on the controversy generated by Rockstar's Grand Theft Auto series, and its message is uniquely poignant due to them being the developers. Rockstar was, and indeed still is, thought of as the company that makes those violent Grand Theft Auto games, so the audience is most likely going to come into any of their games assuming that violence will be a major part of it. Even when Bully was coming out, there was some strange collective expectation that it would have guns in it, as if Rockstar by default was so inseparable from blood that they'd willingly release a game in which you could kill school children for the hell of it. Whereas Bully defied those out-of-place expectations, Manhunt played right into it, creating a far more graphic display for parents to freak out about and for players to flock to. But instead of just reveling in that infamy and using it to make money, Manhunt instead was a metaphorical trap for those people who did go to it to see the blood. It shows how ultimately, the people who do so, at some level, are the monster that Starkweather is. While Manhunt isn't trying to say players are real-life killers or psychopaths, it is pointing out that they hold the same interest as him in using violence for entertainment, and, with the luxury of a consequence-free playground, are just as remorseless. Ah yes, Grand Theft Auto 5, the latest production by Rockstar North. Let's see what grand tale they've got in store for us this time.
What the fuck?
Some blow, and that might make my testimony inadmissible.
You're not admitting anything. There won't be a trial unless you're on a trial for doing blow.
After you ruined my day, stole my friend's shit, capped them, and I'm the one on trial?